This is Peter Helland with the show Israel. I have called the show Jewish Fables, Subverting Whole Houses. That's from Timothy, actually from Titus. St. Paul actually had the same theme in 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. The theme seems to be the same, and that is that the elders are their job is to teach sound doctrine and close the mouths of those who are teaching false doctrine. It says in Titus, holding fast the faithful word. This is for elders. After he describes they have to have real strong character, then their job is to hold fast the faithful word as he has been taught, that he may be able by sound doctrine both to exhort and to convince the gainsayers. In Jude it says the job of the Christian is to contend for the faith once delivered. Here it says, hold fast the faithful word as he has been taught, which kind of implies not as he has taught himself, but as the faith that was once delivered has been passed on and is to be kept orthodox, you would say. And then he goes on and says, those of the circumcision are subverting whole houses, teaching things which they ought not for filthy lucre's sake. Now, when he says circumcision there, it's another word for the Jews, because the word circumcision either refers to the Jews or it refers to Christians. Israel can refer to the Jews or it can refer to Christian. The word Jew can mean Christian or Jew. And only a couple times does St. Paul say that the true Jew is the Christian. Usually the word Jew represents those people who ultimately rejected Christ. And in today's world, if somebody who is from a Jewish heritage, who is Jewish, if they were to accept Christ, then they would no longer be considered Jewish by the fellow Jews. So that if all the Jews were to come to Christ, there would be no Jews left on the earth. That's kind of the idea. And the commandment here is not giving heed to Jewish fables. That is the command. And Jewish fables, subverting whole houses. Martin Luther, one of his last books that he wrote was called On the Jews and Their Lies. I think it's well understood he went over the top on this. Romans 11 says, do not get arrogant over against the Jews. Remember that it actually says in the Gospels, salvation is of the Jews. So there is a certain type of respect that goes toward the Jews, knowing that from them the oracles of God were given, plus many other things. So the thought would be is that Luther fell into that error of being arrogant against the Jews, and then you see Germany following in the path. And so by the time 1860s, 1870s, hardly any of their big theologians believed in the resurrection. I mean, actually, I was always told by 1970 they finally had a theologian of prominence that believed in the resurrection. Walter Pannenberg came out and defended the resurrection. That was kind of unknown for a German theologian to do that, and you'd have to guess that their whole heritage came from Luther, and they were kind of put under a blindness. So Luther was accusing the Jews, perhaps, and I'm not trying to understand Luther perfectly, but if he was violating Romans 11 and being arrogant toward the Jews of their blindness, then God ends up blinding the Germans. So humility, Augustine said, is the greatest virtue. However, Paul does talk about the Jewish fables, which kind of corresponds with the Jews and their lies. And we are to be on our guard against those of the circumcision subverting whole houses. And where do we track this? Where did this come into the country? And I would say the best place to look is at Cotton Mather's last book, which was just published in 1995. He wrote, the story goes, it's almost like a legend, but it's more than a legend. He wrote 430 books. as he was living in the wilderness of America. And his last book, I think it's practically his last book, was never published. He sent it to the publisher in England, and the publisher died. And so the clean manuscript was never found, and the old manuscript was finally resurrected by Reiner Smolinski. And in 1995, he made public Mather's last book, which is an astonishing book because he rejected the faith, the fundamental faith of the Puritans. His dad was Increase Mather. His dad was president of Harvard. And listening to a lecture, George Grant was saying that Increase Mather was considered the most powerful man in America. And if you look at the facts, in America, every Supreme Court justice in America has gone through at Harvard or Yale, and Yale was basically an offshoot of Harvard. So you're not going to be a Supreme Court justice unless you have attended Harvard and Yale. And Harvard was extremely philo-Semitic. They were going to Hebrew, their commencement speeches oftentimes were in Hebrew. And today we see they finally had a case, the Supreme Court stopped the transgender so that the guys could go into girls' bathrooms in the public schools. Apparently it's been put on a halt because the Supreme Court voted 5-3 against that. Well, who do you think the three were totally for the whole transgender agenda? The three Jews on the Supreme Court. And the last nominee for the Supreme Court by President Obama, I think his name was Garland, was another Jewish fellow. So the Jews are 2 or 3% of the population, and yet we have 3 on the Supreme Court. It's a very unequal representation. And yet we're fanatic about equality in other areas, but the main area where there should be equality in representing America, which was a Protestant country, we have 3 Jews and 6 Catholics. And they are out there pushing equality like in a frenzy. But the equality is not there at the main place. How did that happen? I think Cotton Mather's last book is very revealing. Smolinski has the chapter, The New Hermeneutics and the Jewish Nation in Cotton Mather's Eschatology. So Cotton Mather had a revolution in his last book against some of the main ideas of the Puritans, especially his dad, Increase Mather. Let's track that real swiftly, and then we'll bring this thing back to Titus and how does this affect us on the ground where we live in America. So Increase Mather, this is Smolinski writing. As Increase Mather explained the doctrine, now we're talking about the doctrine that there was going to be a huge revival coming up. And that revival was going to occur when the Jews return back to their land in Palestine, convert to Christ, huge revival, Christ is going to come back. And when Christ comes back, he sets up the 1,000-year millennial kingdom. This was radically believed. And Increase Mather wrote several books on it. And he writes, as Increase Mather explained the doctrine in the book, The Mystery of Israel's Salvation, 1669, quote, one of those great and glorious things which the world are in expectation of at this day is the general conversion of the Israelitish nation. The Jews who have been trampled upon by all nations shall shortly become the most glorious nation in the whole world, and all other nations shall have them in great esteem and honor. This was radically believed by the Puritans. So let's move on to the main chapter that really, where Cotton Mather explodes this and demolishes this, what you would call a Jewish fable, that St. Paul would call Jewish fables. So in chapter 11, it's called, Cotton Mather writes, a national conversion of the Jews, whether to be looked for. Okay, so he's saying this national conversion of the Jews, which the Puritans are all looking for, is it true? And his dad died a few years before he wrote this book, and he was not going to challenge his dad while he was alive, because back then you totally respected your dad and you did everything to submit to them. And Cotton tried to submit to his dad on this point. So he writes that, now it must be confessed that there are so many passages in the sacred scriptures which at first seem to have such an aspect as to render it not at all marvelous that this opinion has been so much imbibed. And it is to be confessed that many of those who have been zealous abettors and assertors of this opinion have been the best of men, and persons of as great sagacity and erudition as any that can be found among the children of men. But what if, after all, it should be found that the opinion is a mistake? An opinion really unscriptural as well as irrational, and not very agreeable to the whole tenor and spirit of the gospel. He goes on. And he basically was worried that this opinion put people asleep. And he calls it this. He says, he calls it a strong opiate, which binds on the chains of the dead sleep, wherein the church is to be found, when the day of the Lord shall break in like a thief in the night upon the world. And he says, what is this opiate? It is a strong opinion that before the coming of the Lord there shall be a national conversion of the circumcised people, descended from the 12 tribes of Israel, who are to return unto their ancient seats in Palestine and make a singular figure in the kingdom of God, and be distinguished from and superior to the rest of the nations, that shall then also be generally converted unto Christian piety. He grew up under it. His dad wrote several books on it. This dominated Harvard, dominated the American Puritans, and it has been the fertile soil undergirding the whole American experiment. So Christians in this country, I meet them all the time, who really believe that America came into existence to help create the nation of Israel, help support the nation of Israel. So it's good to understand, how did this come to pass? Well, the Puritans had a fanatical belief. So let's see what Cotton Mather keeps saying about it. Okay, so he's worried about this opinion that Christ cannot come back until this happens. And when, of course, we don't see this happening, he's saying, therefore, they're not worried. They're going to be like in the days of Noah. The world's going on perfect. They don't see any reason why it's going to change. Everything's going to go on as it is. And then he writes, this 'tis that obliges me to spend some thoughts upon it, and inquire whether we are to look upon ourselves as excused from all apprehension that the day of Christ is at hand, until we see the Israelitish nation miraculously converted unto the faith of Christ, and restored unto the country once possessed by their fathers. It is with a most humble and even trembling heart and hand that I think of disputing against an opinion that has had so many and so mighty patrons. But the authorities which may be brought as demonstrations of an opinion, while they oblige my modesty, they will not oblige my compliance. I can owe them no more of regard than Austin, writing against Crescentius, paid unto Cyprian. Hear now my reasoning. Our Lightfoot, with his usual modesty, said upon this problem, though I am unwilling to recede from the charitable opinion of most Christians, yet I see not how the supposal can be digested without some alloy and mitigation. And then Cotton Mather says, and I would freely say, though I am unwilling to recede from the charitable and almost universal opinion of the Christian world about a future conversion of the Jewish world, yet I see not how to digest the difficulties. So he calls it was almost a universal opinion at the time of Cotton Mather, and he was completely conversant with all the major theologians in Europe and, of course, in small America. So in the world that he lived in, he called it the universal opinion of Christians. And, of course, he was a Protestant of the Reformed Calvinist tradition, so they did not see the Catholic Church as on their side. So the Protestant Christians that he knew. Then he writes, I desire to be instructed whether the sacred prophecies, which are now frequently interpreted as importing a general conversion of the Israelitist nation to Christianity, still to be expected, be not really accomplished already. Or whether those that are not so must not have their accomplishment in the world to come, and after the conflagration meaning the burning of the earth on the last day. Okay, so then he goes in and explains why he thinks they were already accomplished. He talks about the 12 tribes, the 10 tribes, and how all these prophecies were already fulfilled in Israel. And then he says, but then, if still we cannot see some of the prophecies about a returning Israel to our satisfaction accomplished in what we have yet seen done for the 12 tribes aforesaid, it is now time to remember that mens legis ex lex, the mind of the law is the law, and there is a surrogate Israel, which puts in a claim to them, and we are the circumcision. So he's saying, we are Israel. We're the circumcision. The Gentiles, the Christians who believed on Christ. The style of the prophecies is indeed such as best suited the dispensation under which they were uttered. Nevertheless, we who are the heirs of the promises have been taught of God how to interpret them agreeably to our dispensation. So he goes on, and he says, we can, with an astonishing satisfaction, interpret the promises unto Israel as fulfilled in what is done for us, and say, O our God, we are thine Israel, and thy faithfulness faileth not. So he goes on, and he says, but I must acknowledge, there lies one thing in my way that obliges me a little to stand still. I am stopped at the 9 last chapters of Ezekiel, and when the book is delivered unto me by one saying, read this, I pray thee, I must say, I am not learned. This is Cotton Mather, the most learned man like we said before on the show. Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge said he's probably the greatest American we ever had. The guy was so godly and so learned, there was nobody that could even compete with him on all levels. And Theodore Roosevelt recognized, because he was a very learned man, well-read man, that Cotton Mather was the greatest American ever lived from a Christian point of view. His knowledge, his godliness, the whole package. And he's saying he didn't even understand the last 9 chapters of Ezekiel. Yea, if the book be delivered unto one of the learned, by one saying, read this, I pray thee, even he must say, I cannot, for it is sealed. I am as much at a loss about the deep sense of these chapters as Curius was when he said the utmost that can be that we can reach about it is but opinion. Okay. So then he goes on, and he says, but can a Christian admit such a vain imagination? Oh yeah, here's what he says. There are now people teaching, but then if we bring these hard chapters to prove a return of the 12 tribes to possess their land, see, that's what they're trying to say. Those last 9 chapters prove that the 12 tribes are going to come back and possess their land in Palestine. And Cotton Mather says, but then if we bring these hard chapters to prove a return of the 12 tribes to possess their land and erect a temple as to be yet expected in this world, they prove too much. A Winston and Company will here pretend proofs that the Mosaic pedagogy is also to be restored, which is what they teach everywhere, and a worship like that of the old Judaic temple revived. This is what they teach. Grace Theological Seminary, Dallas Theological Seminary, Moody, this is what they teach and have been teaching. Bethel College, when I was there they taught it, but now they've changed, because right now there is a revolution. Things are changing. There's churches that taught this, and then slowly they're getting rid of it. But he says, but can a Christian admit such a vain imagination and bring in Moses again and a carnal tabernacle, which will cut off a right unto the altar we now live upon? Theodoret long ago did not amiss to laugh at Apollinaris for it, nor we now at a Toland, a guy that was promoting us at the time. What shall we do then? And he says, Cotton Mather says, and yet let us not lie down like a stag in a net. utterly despairing to get out of the toils. The wise men of inquiry have at length been so inquisitive as to be not altogether unsuccessful in their essays to form thoughts upon these visions of Ezekiel, which may a little satisfy us. And among them, those which our Loth has offered us in his commentary would contribute not a little to our satisfaction. So he goes through and he explains what great scholars, and there have been minds that have tackled these hard chapters, the last 9 chapters of Ezekiel, and made them be. And he says, in short, here's what those 9 last chapters are, which found they're a great foundation to this theology that really believes that the Jewish nation is going to come back and be the ruler over the world for 1,000 years. Cotton Mather writes, in short, when the new heavens and the new earth arrive, these 9 chapters will be better understood than they are ever like to be before. That which would yet more incline one to such sentiments is that when Moses and afterwards the other favorites of heaven were by the hand of God upon them transported into the heavenly world, they all had exhibited unto them a temple, after the pattern of which first the tabernacle of Moses and then the temple of Solomon were formed. And these holy places were, as our apostle tells us, but small figures of the true, even of heaven itself. And in the heavenly world John saw such a temple, even such a one as Ezekiel saw, and such a one as was built by Solomon, and such a one as had things in it which were not in that which was built by Zerubbabel. But that which yet more confirms the sentiments is that our Ezekiel's visions are ushered in with the resurrection of the dead and the state wherein the tabernacle of God shall be with men and he will be with God. And he says, I may now fairly dismiss the subject. So he said that was a huge obstacle. And the Christians today really, a lot of them cannot explain those 9 chapters, and so therefore they believe, well, these 9 chapters explain that the Jews are going to have their temple back. And then he goes in to the second obstacle. And these are the strongholds that have captured Christians today. And Cotton Mather is going right to the strongholds that have captured, especially American Christians, on this issue, and why these strongholds have turned America into a radical supporter of the interests of Israel. The second one is, one of the main props which has been brought for the hopes of great things yet remaining to be done for the Jews, and what my rare Witzius lays much stress upon, is in that promise in Deuteronomy 30, verse 5. The Lord thy God will do thee good and multiply thee above thy fathers. And since we can't find in all the years after the return from the Chaldean and before the coming of the Roman captivity, any term of time wherein the Jews were prospered above their fathers in the days of Solomon, they say it remains to be in this world accomplished. It's another huge argument they give off of Deuteronomy 35. But then Cotton Mather says, but are these excellent men aware that the promise expressly runs upon that condition? Quote, when thou shalt return unto the Lord thy God and shalt obey his voice. However, I will satisfy myself that in the world to come, the true Israel of God shall have it most literally and abundantly accomplished. And the Orthodox Jews, I've talked to them many times. I've seen them protest. They condemn the nation of Israel, the Orthodox Jews. They say this is not of God. They're emphatic about it. This is a cursed nation. It was started by communists and Marxists. The Orthodox Jews say that continually. You can just Google it and you'll see. The Orthodox Jews condemn the nation of Israel as a nation that's godless. So Cotton Mather writes, thus do we begin to get clear of our obligation to embrace the opinion of an exalted condition for the Israelitist nation upon earth before the coming of the Lord and the burning of the world. We have left the patrons of the opinion very little, if any at all, to say for it. Very little, yes. Our 11th chapter to the Romans. 'Tis a chapter which affords a triumph to our friends and assures them that the blindness in part has happened unto Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. Yet they shall be grafted in again upon the olive tree. They shall be received again, and in their national conversion there will be a salvation of all Israel and a life from the dead unto the Gentiles. How many admirable men, besides the younger Alting and the later Junius, have by their comments on this chapter thought that they have put this matter beyond contestation. The Puritans were captured by the arguments for this, and Cotton Mather just blew the arguments away and created a freedom that we now can enjoy, because his arguments are better than anybody's. You know, the most popular book of the 20th century, besides Scofield's reference Bible, was probably Hal Lindsey, for Christians, was Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth. If you put up Hal Lindsey's been like married 3 times, and he's basically a disaster from the old tradition way of holiness. We're following a guy like Hal Lindsey when we could be following a guy that's 100 times more godly and 100 times, speaking figuratively, 100 times more knowledgeable, and yet we follow guys like Hal Lindsey. He wrote that book in 1970, and it came out in my small town in the Dells. They put these like Chariots of the Gods, these kind of popular books on the rack, and you look over, what kind of weird book have they got out now? Chariots of the Gods. Well, then, Late Great Planet Earth, you know, and then everybody read it and went with it. So he goes on and says the 11th chapter is the key chapter. And that was what we started out with, that Martin Luther violated, you could argue, violated Romans 11, where it says, be careful. God has rejected the Jews, and he's chosen you Gentiles. Be careful that you don't get haughty against him, because he could always bring him back in, and he could always take you out. So be fearful. So he writes, but then let us hear our apostle's conclusion upon the whole. As the very spirit of the whole epistle to the Romans does discountenance this opinion of great things intended for the circumcised Jews in the latter days, by still making the genuine offspring of Abraham to be a spiritual offspring, and showing that all were not Israel, that were of Israel. That's Romans 9. Not all, it's a quote from Romans 9. Not all were of Israel, showing that all were not Israel that were of Israel, nor were all Israel those that were of Israel. So the conclusion of the matter in this chapter does utterly confound it. The words are, until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in, and so all Israel shall be saved. And he kind of goes in, there's a theologian that's really good on this, is O. Palmer Robertson, and he goes through the Greek text on the blindness in part has happened unto Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles come in, and so all Israel will be saved. And he has 2 Greek words there, and so all Israel will be saved. It's usually mistranslated. It usually says, and then all Israel will be saved, people say. The Greek word is just the opposite. It doesn't mean, it's not a time, it doesn't mean then. It means and in this matter. It's kai hutos. And then there's akrasou, until the fullness of the Gentiles. And if you understand the word akrasou, it creates a whole different understanding. And Cotton Mather goes into it a little different way, but he explains that you need to understand what it's actually saying. And he writes, and he goes through that, and he says, I don't see that the opinion has now any one support left unto it. Now I beseech you, sirs, have the patience to see and weigh what I have to offer against your opinion, and hath compelled me to abandon it. And they tried to, the people around Cotton Mather at this time totally tried to suppress his change of mind on this. I mean, they did, how do you explain it? They tried to do what our government does. They tried to cover up. They tried to, not let people know that he had changed, because Cotton Mather was even considered better than his dad, who was the most powerful man in America, the president of Harvard. And Cotton Mather was maybe more godly and more holy than his dad and more learned. And Mather really saw through this. He writes, it is commonly supposed that the Jews, upon their national conversion, will be still distinguished from the Gentiles. And what will they enjoy? And that they will enjoy their peculiar dignities. But what can there be to distinguish them? Okay, so he goes on and he says, for the language of a distinct nation, they have none. Well, they have it now. Okay, so they would say, well, Mather, you were wrong. And their circumcision must cease with the other Mosaic ordinances. Richard Baxter, which was one of the prominent, a real good friend of his dad, Increased Mather. Richard Baxter was a theologian that was contesting with his dad on this issue. Wrote books against his dad, but they were good friends. Baxter said, to propose the continuance of them in a Jewish peculiarity is a downright wickedness and contrary to the very nature of Christianity. And the truth is, I would have no more hand in rebuilding the partition wall between Jews and Gentiles, which the blessed Jesus has thrown down so long ago, than I would in rebuilding the sunk walls of Jericho. In short, if the Jews were all made Christians, there would in a few years be no Jews left in the world. And we're going to get back to Titus chapter 2 here, and we'll conclude his finding here. And he says, these meditations have at length forced me to resign the opinion. This is at the very end of his life. He died not too soon after his dad. But these meditations have at length forced me to resign the opinion as part of the hay and stubble which will not abide the fire of the day which will declare what is the truth and what is not. Indeed, it appeared unto me a paradox that an opinion should prevail so far and so long and be embraced by such good men by a host of God, and yet after all be found in error, calculated for and contributing to the faulty sleep of the latter times. It is to me no less a paradox how it has been possible for Christians to give into that maxim of the Jews, which the Talmuds ascribe to a blade called Rabbi Samuel, who said, there will be no difference between our days and the days of the Messiah, but this, that in those days, the kingdoms of the world will be brought under. Or what mighty benefit Christians can propose to themselves by having Jews made their lords and exercising a dominion over them. That's exactly what they teach. In the millennium, and I go to the Friends for Israel conference at Grace Theological Seminary. I just went a couple weeks ago. And it's a strong theme. And during the 1,000-year reign after Christ comes back, the Jews are going to rule the world from Jerusalem, and the Christians will be subservient to them. He goes on, and he closes. To learn Fuller in his History of the Holy War, speaking of the stately Christian church, built on the floor which was once the place of Solomon's temple, has a remark, that heaven seemed not well pleased in the Christians not leaving that floor to its perpetual desolations. Inasmuch as the Christians were often beat out of it, and at this day, this is at the Temple Mount right in Israel, and at this day whoever enters it, though ever so casually, must renounce his religion or die for it. That's the Muslim temple right there in Jerusalem. On that remark I pass no censure. But so much I would say, I am not for building too much on Solomon's temple. I don't see that heaven will be well pleased with it, or that our gospel will much allow of it, that we should propose any other than to leave even the nation as well as the temple of Solomon, as to any revival thereof in secular appearances under perpetual desolations. Even the Orthodox Jews say, unless the Messiah reestablishes the nation, we should have nothing to do with anybody trying to reestablish that nation unless the Messiah does it. Even the Orthodox Jews say it. And Cotton Mather is saying, do not get involved in reestablishing the nation of Israel. It will be to your destruction. And then he says, what has befallen the golden vessels of the temple? I doubt carries a sad emblem and symptom of what must be the fate of the nation which they once belonged unto. So the golden vessels were lost. And he explains they were lost. And he says, the fate of the Jews as a nation is the same fate as the golden vessels that were in the temple, that no one's expecting to recover. And then he concludes, if I go to restore that nation in circumstances that shall give them a distinction from and a superiority to the rest of the Christian world, which is America's whole project. It's what a lot of Christians believe America came into existence for, to help reestablish the nation of Israel. And here's probably the greatest American that we've ever had, saying, if I go to restore the nation in circumstances that shall give them a distinction from and a superiority to the rest of the Christian world, I am stopped as the Jews were when the impious Julian the Apostate encouraged them to rebuild their temple. and a fire breaks out and consumes all my materials. In other words, when Julian the Apostate tried to, he got the Jews to help rebuild that temple, supernatural fires came out, earthquakes happened, and even he says, even the pagan writers, this is what Cotton Mather said, a thing which the report of pagan writers will compel us to believe, while the silence of some Christian writers about it is justly wondered at. The Christians were silent. They didn't even want to talk about it. Just like today, they don't want to talk about it. But the pagan writers said, hey, those fires came from God. So you try to rebuild that temple, God's going to take you out. And Cotton Mather is saying, if you give yourself to a project of trying to restore the nation of Israel, God will destroy you. It's not a message. This book was published in 1995. It's something that needs to be heard. Now, how does that relate to the Jewish fable of Titus? And we're commanded not to give heed to Jewish fables. Now, this is the Jewish fable, that the Jews are going to have this unbelievably fantastic kingdom and they're going to be ruling the world. Now, why did Paul say don't be giving heed to Jewish fables? Because that, he feared, is what would happen. That is a potential possibility that we would be giving heed, and Cotton Mather exploded it. He was born in it. That's all he knew. It's like being born a Hindu, and then you got to break through on it. He was born into this Jewish fable. The Puritans were considered Judaizers. Some people called the Puritans Jews. And Cotton Mather, only at the end of his life, after his dad died, he would pray. If you read other sections, he was agonizing, praying, fasting, pleading with the Lord, show me what the deal is here. Because they fell into the error of giving heed to Jewish fables. Now, what comes along with giving heed to Jewish fables is the subversion of whole houses. And the elders, their job is by sound doctrine both to exhort and to convince the gainsayers, those who are teaching Jewish fables and other things. For there are many unruly and vain talkers and deceivers, especially they of the circumcision, whose mouths must be stopped, who subvert whole houses, teaching things which they ought not, for filthy lucre's sake. I'm skipping 2 verses. Not giving heed to Jewish fables and commandments of men that turn from the truth. They profess that they know God, but in works they deny him. Now, let's look at that. They profess that they know God, but in works they deny him. St. Paul, when he was Saul, was in the name of God was killing Christians, capturing them, make sure they were put to death. And Jesus stopped him on the Damascus road. And Jesus said, why are you persecuting me? So what Saul was doing to the Christians, Jesus said, you're doing it to me. And Jesus said, what you do to the least of these, my brethren, you're doing this unto me. So I was hungry, and you fed me, or you didn't feed me. I was thirsty, you gave me water, or you didn't give me water. And they go, what are you talking about? I don't even know what you're talking about. I don't remember you hungry. I don't remember you. And Jesus said, what you did to the least of these, my brethren. So the principle is, if you say you love God and you don't love your fellow brother, you don't love God. So they profess that they know God, but in works they deny him. So let's break it down to the context here. He's talking about sound doctrine, teaching sound doctrine. 1 Timothy is about sound doctrine. The example was particularly dealing with slaves. Slaves, you are to consider your master worthy of all honor. This is the teaching of the words of Jesus Christ. If anybody ignores this teaching, that slaves are to obey their masters unto Christ, if anybody tampers with this teaching, they're a heretic of the worst sort. And no movement ever challenged the idea that the slave-master relationship was not authorized by God, if done properly. Nobody ever challenged that. It was first challenged by the abolitionist movement that came out of America. And it had to do with subverting whole houses that Titus was talking about. It says, let as many slaves as are under the yoke count their own masters worthy of all honor. And the context is, the first part of the chapter is, Paul said to Timothy, that thou mightest charge some that they teach no other doctrine. And that Greek word, heterodidaskale, appears one more time at the end of the chapter, the last chapter, chapter 6. And he says that doctrine pertains to where most Christians live. Most of the Christians, about half the Christians, were literally slaves. Because God called, the ones that God called, he says in 1 Corinthians, were the lowest. Consider your calling, my brother. Not many mighty, not many noble. God has purposely chosen the poor of the world to be rich in faith. He's chosen the ones that the world rejects to be his. So half the people in the church, a lot of scholars believe, were slaves. And so that was a huge issue. Paul kept talking about the slaves all the time. Almost every letter he wrote, he addressed the slaves. Slaves, obey your masters as unto Christ. Consider your masters worthy of all honor. And then he goes, and these things you're to teach and exhort. He said, not only am I teaching them, I want you to be constantly teaching what the slaves, how the slaves ought to treat their masters, how the masters ought to treat their slaves. And then he says, if any man teaches otherwise, and consents not to wholesome words, even the words of our Lord Jesus Christ on this matter, and to the doctrine which is according to godliness. Now, we don't consider that a godly doctrine. Nobody touches it. If you don't agree with this, you're proud. There's a whole list of stuff. You suppose that gain is godliness, and you are to withdraw. And of course, the Southerners then, that was what they quoted, and they justified their secession based on that. And however, you can't have it both ways, because this is part of sound doctrine. It comes as a package. So the Southerners were guilty of rebelling against the king. Well, that's part of the package of sound doctrine. You can't violate one aspect of it, and then you can't say, well, we're not going to submit to King George because we don't, we're just not going to submit to him. We're going to rebel, and we're going to take a war against them. And then you're going to turn around and tell the slaves, well, but you've got to obey us. Complete hypocrisy. The world picked up on it. The African Americans, as we know, they picked up on it. And it was the hypocrisy. You can't, he that breaks the law at even one point is guilty of the whole law. So if the law of obeying authority, whether it's the king, whether it's your husband, whether it's your parents, whether it's your master, that's got to be consistent. Because Paul says the elder is to, by sound doctrine, maintain solid teaching. And he says, but speak thou the things which become sound doctrine. Speak on those things which deal with sound doctrine. Stop the mouths of those who are subverting whole houses, and they're teaching Jewish fables. And they're chiefly those of the circumcision. What was the sound doctrine? Well, it really pertains to this country, okay? And this is where the Southerners blew it. I believe John Henry Hopkins, he was the head of the Episcopal Church in America, and he was Bishop of Vermont during the Civil War. He basically said the South is right on their position on slavery. Not that they're right on like a race-based slavery, delegating the African Americans to this special class, but on the principle that there is a relationship in the Bible called master and slave, and it can be done right, and the Bible affirms it. It's shocking to the American mind. But even the northern bishops, even the most preeminent divines in the north, said the South was right on that. However, they were not right. They were hypocritical. And that was pointed out by John Wesley and John Fletcher, the people who started the Methodist Church. And they said the American Revolution was revolutionary. They equated it with the principles of Satan. And in Wesley and Fletcher's books, written in 1775, 1776, this is what they constantly taught. And what they said was, first of all, that it was the principles of Satan himself that the Americans were following. And here's what Fletcher, who was Wesley's appointed successor, and he says, I need not tell you, sir, that this speech of the patriotic seraph is formed upon the principles laid down in Dr. Price's pamphlet. And Dr. Price was formulating the principles of that founded the American Revolution. And the patriotic seraph is Lucifer or Satan. And he starts out by saying, nothing can exceed the wickedness of Dr. Price's patriotic principles, except the insolence of that which follows. I suppose it was made by Satan to the Son of God when, according to Milton's fancy, they encountered each other in the heavenly plains. And Satan says to Jesus, I meet thee in the field, says the fiend, to defend my freedom and to assert the liberty of these heavenly legions. Before I pierce thy side, Jesus, with my spear, let me pierce thy conscience with my arguments. So Satan is given, here's my arguments why I'm right and you're wrong, Jesus. And he says, in a free state, much more in heaven where liberty is perfect, everyone is his own legislator. To be free is to be guided by one's own will, and to be guided by the will of another is the character of servitude. So this is the whole demonic, satanic argument, and Fletcher and Wesley, they go through on this. And they just pull out all the cliches that we've grown under, that authority comes from the consent of the governed, of course not from God. And for government is an institution for the benefit of the people governed, which they have power to model as they please. Liberty may be enjoyed in every possible degree. Liberty is most complete and perfect when the people have most of a share in government and of a controlling power over the persons by whom it is administered. So basically, Wesley and Fletcher are saying the American principles, the argument they're given for their experiment, their nation, is the same exact argument that Satan gave and persuaded the angels to go against God. And then he concludes, he says, I need not tell you, sir, that this speech of the patriotic seraph is formed upon the principles laid down in Dr. Price's pamphlet. Now, what was the effect of it? And if you go back to page 70 of Fletcher's book here, American Patriotism Farther Confronted with Reason, Scripture, and the Constitution, he says it's going to affect sound doctrine. It's going to affect the relationships. He said, what would he think of my candor? He's talking about the doctor. These two big theologians, one out of Bristol and one out of London, Evans and Price. He says the doctor's argument is, I fear, invidious, dangerous. What would he think of my candor if, treading in his steps, I reflected on the subordination of wives to their husbands, soldiers to their generals, flocks to their pastors, servants to their masters, and creatures to their Creator, in the same manner in which he reflects on the subordination of subjects to their sovereigns. So the whole issue was, do subjects have to obey their sovereign? Do you have to obey the king? It says, fear God and honor the king. Are you supposed to honor and obey the king and pay taxes? It was a simple thing. And the American Christians, which Wesley and Fletcher would have said, Christians, justified their revolt. And you could say it was kind of similar to Henry VIII justifying, revolting, I can divorce this woman and marry anybody I want, and if the Pope doesn't like it, then I'll kick all the monasteries out of England, which is half the land of England, and I'll just grab it. Then I'll be the spiritual head of England. Well, did the Americans pretty much do the same thing as Henry VIII? Was it just a land grab? Was it just for money? Was it just for power? And they used religion as a ploy? That's what Wesley and Fletcher were definitely saying. And he says, he's saying this relationship of the subordination of subjects to sovereigns is it has to be done very carefully. Any violation of that will then have serious ramifications on the other relationships. So once you tamper with the subordination, that the subjects have to obey the king, and you do what we did, we got rid of the word subjects. We're not subject to any authority. We're citizens. We're the government, of the people, by the people, for the. We're the government. The government must serve us. We're the master and they're our servant. Well, Wesley and Fletcher were saying, yep, that's Satan's argument. Right to the T. That's his argument. So you guys are following Satan. Right to the T. But Saul didn't want to believe he was wrong until Jesus stopped him on the Damascus road. But Wesley and Fletcher says that a little bit of leaven leavens the whole lump. So once you tamper with that relationship of the subject to the king and you turn it on its head, he says, watch all the other relationships turn themselves on their head. Watch the wives become actually the head of the home. And then down the road, watch the children actually become the head, rule over the parents. The whole slave-master relationship, that's going to be toast. That relationship will be gone. You probably might even have a huge civil war to get rid of it. Okay? Because what was that civil war about? To get rid of that relationship. We got rid of the relationship of subjects to masters, and we exist to locate any tyrant out there, and we're going to blow them away. But you can't compartmentalize. A little bit of leaven leavens the home. Most wives rule their men. The women are ruling the men, and they have been for the longest time, and it's only getting worse. And the children have been ruling the parents, and it's only getting worse because everything's turned on its head. And that was written extensively by the founders of what became the largest church in America. The Methodist Church became, for the most part, the biggest church in America. And we completely ignore what they're saying. And if you Google, you go to sermon audio, there's 1.2 million sermons on there. And then you can type in, I want a sermon on suffering. I want a sermon on obedience. And you'll get hundreds and hundreds, okay? Well, you type in Jewish Fables, because most of them still go by the King James Bible. You type in Jewish Fables, Titus chapter 1, verse 14, and you'll get nothing. Nothing. So they're having all these sermons about, issues, but they're not the key issue. You won't find any sermon where Jesus said, if you curse your parents, you're to be put to death. Children that curse their parents, Jesus said, are to be put to death. You don't even have a sermon on that out of 1.2 million that tackle that. They're afraid to tackle it. But the issue is, the elders are to teach sound doctrine, and sound doctrine is subjects obey the king. You're not citizens, you're subjects. The king, you're to honor and obey the king as his subjects. We got rid of that. And in chapter 2 of Titus, but speak thou the things which become sound doctrine. And what are some of the things? That the older women teach the younger women to be sober, to love their husbands, to love their children, to be discreet, chaste, keepers at home, good, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God be not blasphemed. That's sound doctrine. That is what's supposed to be taught. If you're going to teach something else than this, make sure everybody is completely walking in this before you would teach anything else. And also, Paul mentions elsewhere, the wife is to phobia her husband. Fear her husband. And if the wives are not fearing and obeying their husbands as unto Christ, they profess that they know God, but if they're not obeying their husband as unto Christ, in works they deny him. That's a big one. Well, I'm a Christian. Well, do you obey your husband as unto Christ? Wisdom is the fear of the Lord. Job 28, wisdom is the fear of God. And if you disobey your husband, you're disobeying God. Particularly, you're disobeying Christ. So, you're denying. You profess that you know God, but in your actions, you deny him by the way you rebel against your husband. And when you rebel against your husband, all your kids are watching. And by your act of rebellion to your husband, anything that's less than fearing your husband and obeying him, anything that's less than that, wouldn't it be called rebellion? And your kids will pick it up. And anytime they watch TV and that kind of behavior is modeled on TV, you're allowing them to drink in the poison of rebellion. Then, of course, we don't have slave masters anymore, but there's a huge section that slaves are to obey their masters as unto Christ. We got rid of that. That whole concept is gone. Put them in mind to be subject to principalities and powers, to obey magistrates. No, we don't, we got this election with Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, and basically, all we're going to be doing is cursing. All we do basically is curse both of them. Then whoever gets in, we're going to at least have half the nation every day cursing them. When the scripture says, Paul said, I'd give Hymenaeus and Alexander over to Satan, that they may learn not to blaspheme. That was when Nero was in charge. So he gave them over to Satan that they would learn not to be cursing Nero, the most evil ruler ever. But we're going to be cursing who's ever over us. That's the same as somebody cursing their father. And Jesus said, if you curse your father, you're to be put to death. These doctrines are not being taught, and this experiment's going up in smoke. This experiment is in a country that is going to go down so fast that people are going to wonder, it's going to be such a little blip on the time channel that we're not going to even be able to figure it out. So we connect here the Jewish fable, grounded in the Puritan doctrine, which was never changed. Cotton Mather's book was not published until 1995. They covered it up. So we've been floating on the Jewish fables like crazy. And in the which is those of the circumcision, subverting whole houses, turning the moral order on its head in these relationships. So the biblical relationship in all these areas is completely foreign to us. It's foreign in the church. You don't have the woman's covering on the head, the symbol of submission. That was a custom for 1950 years. In all the churches in the world, women had to have a covering on their head as a sign of submission to men. Where's that? After 1950 years, approximately, that is gone. They're not submission. They're not going to have that. So the church is being so influenced by the ungodly world that people don't see a difference. So hopefully this has been helpful for reflection. And this is the show Israel, because that word is important. Because Jesus fulfilled the prophecy. He's the true Israel, and if you belong to Christ, you are the Israel of God. And those promises of eternal life belong to you. And eternal life is what it's all about. So till next time, in Jesus' name, this is Peter Helland on the show Israel.